Hello, I'm Jeremy, and welcome to another episode of Jeremy U's Reviews, where mistreated movies get a second chance. When I first saw the trailer for Madam Web, I assumed it was some Asylum-style mockbuster meant to cash in on the superhero movie craze. But no, this was an official movie made by Sony. I was absolutely gobsmacked by this, and so was everyone else on the internet. Pretty much every critic under the sun clowned on this film's trailer, and countless memes were made, to the point where it made what happened to Morbius seem like a light hug. I actually didn't know if I was going to review Madam Web at first, because I didn't really know if I wanted to spend money on a movie I probably wasn't going to like. But then some friends organized an event where we would watch Madam Web at our local Cinemark, so I not only ended up seeing it, but didn't have to pay any money for the actual film. So what's my verdict? Is Madam Web as bad as the internet made it out to be? Yes. It was just as bad as everyone on the internet made it out to be. The only good things about the movie were the grilled cheese sandwich I ate during it and the part where it ended. Holy cow, do I just absolutely hate Madam Web. Let's start with by far the worst part, the editing. Now, when it comes to editing, I tend not to really hyper-focus on it, as I'm more into the on-screen elements of filmmaking rather than the behind-the-scenes stuff. But the editing in Madam Web is genuinely some of the worst editing I've seen in a theatrically released film. Like, let me give you a picture of what the editing in Madam Web is like. Imagine that you're just sitting, watching a movie, when all of a sudden, the camera does this. Yeah, that's basically what the editing for this garbage fire is like. It's especially bad when the titular Madam Web, Cassie Webb, get it? Because spiders, has her visions. Unlike the Final Destination series, where the visions were coherent in what they tried to portray, even if the visions in the later entries were more stylized, the visions in Madam Web are so fragmented and disorienting that you can't even tell what the heck is happening. Okay, so bad editing is one thing. How are the characters? Well, they aren't characters. To call the sentient organisms that inhabit this movie characters would be an insult to the concept of creating a character. They are not characters. They are sentient cogs whose only purpose is to progress the story. The only character that's worth anything is Ben, because A, unlike most of these cogs, he has something resembling a personality, and B, he's played by the talented Adam Scott, even though Scott is clearly sleepwalking through his performance. The rest, though, just let's get on with this. Starting off with Cassie, my God, what an empty character. Now, the fact that she's played by the woman from 50 Shades of Grey definitely isn't a point in her favor. But even then, Cassie is just such a bland milquetoast, nothing of a character. The only thing I know about this character is that she's a rescue worker. That's it. She has no personality, no likability, not even any unlikability. She's a useless piece of paper we're only supposed to like because she's the protagonist. And she's not evil. That's it. Even ignoring Dakota Johnson's subpar performance as the character, Cassie is just such a nothing burger of a character that makes me beg for someone like Jennifer Walters from She-Hulk, because at least she had a personality. The girls Cassie tries to protect aren't much better. Granted, the one played by Sydney Sweeney does have a little bit of personality, with her being more reserved and obedient, but the other two might as well be the exact same character. They're both equally bland, generic teenage girl characters, and if you switch their lines, nothing would change. Finally, we have the villain Ezekiel, and my god, what a nothing burger of a villain. Now, I will say that in terms of motivation, Ezekiel is decent. Basically, Ezekiel started out as an ally of Cassie's mom, Constance, but he betrayed her by stealing a spider that has the ability to heal others. Years later, Ezekiel gets haunted with visions of spider women killing him, and since he doesn't want to die and lose everything that he has, he wants to kill them before they can kill him. On paper, that's a decent motivation. It makes sense from a logical standpoint, and given how the hero is someone who sees the future, it's appropriate that the villain would be someone who's trying to change their future. The problem comes in the execution. For starters, that motivation is all Ezekiel has. Like Cassie, Ezekiel is just an absolute blank slate of a character. He has no personality beyond being evil and rich. He has no character traits that make him identifiable. His interactions with his assistant are incredibly dispassionate and void of chemistry. He's just a generic I'm evil and that's it villain. We don't even really get any insight in terms of why he does what he does and who Ezekiel is as a person beyond his villainy. Right after he betrays Constance at the start of the film, Ezekiel mentions how he had a hard life growing up and that's why he wanted to steal the spider and make millions, but the film never really delves into that beyond a couple throwaway lines, wasting the potential for Ezekiel to blossom into a more interesting character. But why would we bother delving into our antagonist and getting to know him as a character when we could show Cassie teaching the girls how to do CPR? For those who haven't seen the movie, yes, there is a significant portion of the film dedicated to Cassie teaching the girls CPR. And yes, it is as stupid as it sounds. Not even the actor playing Ezekiel is able to elevate the character. Cassie is one thing, given how she's played by the woman who thought saying yes to a film based on a book based on Twilight BDSM fanfiction was a good idea. But to hear Raheem is just so lifeless and dull as Ezekiel, just going through the generic villain motions and having nothing identifiable about his performance aside from the fact that he looks eerily similar to Hassan Piker. Like, that's honestly a hilarious coincidence. And sure, Raheem is in Madam Web, of course he isn't going to care. But actors have had fun with villains in bad movies before. Look at Jeremy Irons and Angus McFadden. Dungeons & Dragons, the first one from the 90s, and Warriors of Virtue are really dumb, mediocre movies that most people barely talk about. But those two had the absolute time of their lives as their movies' respective villains, with Irons embracing the cheesy sorcerer character to add to an over-the-top degree, and McFadden acting like a coked-out lunatic. Whereas Raheem delivers such a generic and hollow performance that makes an already bland movie even more insufferable to sit through. Not to mention the massive amounts of Raheem's ADR cover-ups that make the Cups Up scene and Kirk Cameron saving Christmas look subtle in comparison. Overall, Ezekiel is just a nothing burger of a villain. He doesn't have anything going for him beyond a somewhat decent motivation. As the character himself isn't engaging, Raheem is very bland in the role, and the film wastes prime opportunity to develop him as a character, to show him either plotting to kill the Spider-Woman or being a generic millionaire villain character you've seen in literally every single superhero movie ever made. An appropriately bland villain for this bland movie. So yeah, all the characters suck. They're bland vessels who exist only to further the story, and I pretty much put more thought into analyzing these characters than the people making this movie put in creating them. Next up is the script, and wow, is it straight trash. The dialogue in Madam Web is basically like if you asked ChatGPT to type out a script for an MCU movie. Every bit of dialogue is either incredibly bland and forgettable, a poor attempt at execution, or humor that's as forced as the humor in Dougal. Except at least with Dougal, that was an American dub of a British/French movie, Whereas in Madame Web, this is the actual original movie. I genuinely can't remember a single line of dialogue from the movie, as everything about the movie's script is so synthetic and fake that it can't even make a memorable impact in a bad way. The only exception is the infamous "he was in the Amazon with my mom while she was researching spiders right before she died," but that's only because that line became a meme. And it wasn't even in the official movie. So yeah, the dialogue is terrible, and I literally could not remember a single line from the movie if you forced a gun to my head. The effects are also genuinely terrible. It's not on the same level as The Flash, where the CGI of that $200 to $220 million movie is on par with The Amazing Bulk. But at the same time, these effects are average at best and genuinely terrible at worst. Like, I will give credit that the flipped car in that Cassie goes to check on in the opening of the movie is actually decently done. I had no idea that the car was CGI until I saw a video breaking down the VFX in Madame Web. I genuinely thought that was a real car that they flipped over, but everything else looks pretty mediocre and generic. Finally, the plot, and my god, what a mess. Madame Web's plot is an interesting paradox, because while there's a ton of dumb stuff that happens in the movie, the plot itself is so bare bones that it feels like nothing's happening. I already mentioned the CPR scene, but there's so much more. For example, after betraying Constance, Ezekiel leaves her for dead, and then an indigenous tribe of spider people just shows up to help Constance because I guess this is the Good Samaritan tribe of spider people. And then after Constance dies in childbirth, the film cuts to a grown-up Cassie in New York, which implies that the spider people were able to somehow send her to New York. Which the film doesn't even bother explaining how that works. And also, the way that Cassie is tied with the girls is so forced, basically just having them be tangentially near her during certain situations she was around for. There's a scene where Cassie is lounging in her apartment and is talking along to a rebroadcast of A Christmas Carol. There's a scene where Cassie alters the future by opening a window to stop a pigeon from crashing into it, where in the original Vision, the pigeon crashed into the window, the effects of which are never really elaborated on in any substantial way. There's a scene where the girls go to this random diner and dance to Toxic by Britney Spears, which is the only reason this movie is set in 2003. Not even kidding. They only set this movie in 2003 so they could play Toxic by Britney Spears. In the same diner, one of the patrons just so happens to be reading a newspaper talking about the kidnapping of the three girls, which is a front page headline within 4 hours of it happening. And the climax... My god, the climax is so dumb. Basically, after hours of just running from Ezekiel and all the dumb stuff I both did and didn't mention, Cassie rescues the girls in an incredibly convoluted and poorly structured action scene and manages to use her powers to save the girls in a very ridiculous and poorly edited scene. Then Cassie goes on this whole diatribe to Ezekiel about how she was the person that the visions would kill Ezekiel, not the girls, how she knew that is like anyone's guess. Ezekiel falls and is crushed to death by a Pepsi sign. Once again, I'm not kidding, that's really how he dies, and yes, that's why Pepsi Man is on the thumbnail of this video. Cassie gets blinded by a firework because the climax took place at an abandoned fireworks factory, and because the original Madame Web character was blind, and we gotta connect this garbage to the original somehow. You know, for like the 5 people who cared about or even knew who Madame Web was originally. And then they tease a sequel with the Spider-Girls, which will never be made because even Sony isn't stupid enough to make a sequel to this garbage. Oh, and despite the fact that the images of the girls in their Spider-Women uniforms were plastered all throughout the trailer, the girls are mostly shown out of costume, and the Spider-Women scenes shown in the trailer are either from Ezekiel's visions or the end of the movie. Talk about false advertising. Overall, Madam Web is an absolute waste of film. It basically feels like Sony was desperate for any Spider-Man character they could use in their little Spider-Man minus Spider-Man universe, and they landed on Madam Web, so they were like, screw it, let's just make a Madam Web movie. These idiots will just buy anything related to Spider-Man. But thankfully, the viewing audience was smarter than they gave them credit for, given how this movie bombed, spectacularly. Every single element of Madam Web feels so utterly fake and soulless, from the plot that somehow feels both contrived and empty, the characters, who are basically just archetypes for the story and nothing more, the script, which feels like a cynical attempt to reverse engineer the MCU formula, and before feeding that reverse engineered formula into an AI that's been smashed with a hammer 500 times to one of the dumbest climaxes in movie history. And while I've seen some people call this a so bad it's good movie, yeah, I'm sorry, I have to disagree. Now, if you had fun with this movie in a mocking guilty pleasure sort of way, that's perfectly fine. Certainly glad you had more fun with it than I did. But this movie just did not do it for me. For me, a so bad it's good movie needs to fail in ways that no other movie fails. The Room has Tommy Wiseau's iconic bad acting and poorly structured plot. Birdemic has the incredibly cheap bird effects and on-the-nose environmental messaging. The Amazing Bulk has backgrounds made entirely out of computer rendering and randomly inserted stock footage. Samurai Cop has over-the-top action scenes, over-the-top lovemaking scenes, and one of the most demented scripts I've ever seen. And don't even get me started on the absolute insane craziness present in Neil Breen's filmography. But Madam Web doesn't have any of that. There's nothing ambitious about it. Nothing that sets itself apart from other bad movies because it didn't try. Madam Web is a dry nothing burger of a movie that represents corporate greed at its absolute peak. It's a miserable, soulless experience made because Sony was stupid enough to think that we would just mindlessly consume this movie simply because it mentions Spider-Man. So yeah, don't watch Madam Web. If you want to riff on it with friends, then maybe you might have some more fun with it than I did. But other than that, avoid this movie like the plague. An absolute worthless experience that's already leaving my brain as we speak, and I'll pretty much forget about entirely until December when critics make their worst movies of 2024 list. So, yeah, that's my Madam Web review. Hope you all enjoyed me talking about this pile of garbage, and I can't wait to talk about stuff that's actually good. Later.